Welcome back, dear friends. Settle comfortably by the fire, pour yourself a cup of tea, and join me for another journey into a world of secrets, whispers, and village mysteries. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know, have you ever met three people who all told the same story, and somehow you knew one of them was lying? Share your thoughts in the comments. I always enjoy reading them. And if you love classic cozy mysteries, quiet English villages, clever clues, and stories inspired by the spirit of the golden age of detective fiction, do consider subscribing and joining our growing community. There are many more mysteries waiting just around the corner. Now then, our story begins in the spring of 1932, in a village where everyone knew everyone else's business, or believed they did. A village where three respectable women shared a secret protected by a lie, and a lie that eventually led to a body. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The Ladies of Bracken Hollow. Bracken Hollow sat in a fold of the English countryside, some 12 miles from the nearest railway station, and several centuries from modern life. Visitors often remarked that the village seemed untouched by time. A narrow high street curved between honey-coloured cottages draped with climbing roses. A blacksmith still worked beside the pond. The church bell rang every quarter hour with reassuring precision. Elderly gentlemen argued about cricket outside the post office, and children rode bicycles beneath ancient elm trees. Nothing exciting ever appeared to happen there. Naturally, this meant that a great deal happened beneath the surface. Miss Jane Marple, who was spending several weeks with an old friend in the neighbouring village of Little Havisham, had not yet heard of Bracken Hollow. She would, very soon. The centre of village society was Bracken House, a handsome Georgian residence overlooking the common. It belonged to Mrs. Lydia Ashcombe. Lydia was 48, wealthy, elegant, and possessed of the sort of calm authority that made people lower their voices when she entered a room. Widowed for nearly 10 years, she lived alone, except for a small staff, and an elderly spaniel named Hector. The villagers admired her. Many feared her. Nobody truly knew her. On a bright Tuesday afternoon, Lydia hosted one of her regular tea gatherings. The drawing room glowed with spring sunlight. Fine china rested upon polished tables. A fire crackled gently despite the mild weather. Only 3 guests had been invited: Mrs. Eleanor Finch, Miss Beatrice Wren, and Mrs. Violet Harcourt. The 4 women had known one another for nearly 20 years. Outwardly, they were friends. Inwardly, matters were considerably more complicated. Eleanor Finch, a doctor's widow, was practical and intelligent. She possessed sharp eyes and a habit of noticing details other people missed. Beatrice Wren, unmarried and 52, taught music in the village. She was nervous by nature and frequently appeared startled even when nothing had happened. Violet Harcourt was younger than the others by several years. Attractive and charming, she maintained an image of effortless confidence. The 4 women sat around a tea table while sunlight streamed through tall windows. Conversation flowed politely. Weather, gardens, church repairs, the upcoming village fete. Nothing unusual, at least not at first. Then Lydia set down her teacup. A tiny movement, yet it altered the atmosphere instantly. "I received a letter this morning," she said. Nobody answered immediately. Beatrice's hand paused halfway toward a cake stand. Violet looked down at her lap. Eleanor became very still. Lydia watched them carefully. "How curious," she continued. "What sort of letter?" asked Eleanor. "A letter concerning something that happened 15 years ago." Silence. Outside, a rook called from a distant tree. Inside, nobody moved. Beatrice swallowed visibly. "I don't know what you mean." Lydia's smile was slight. "I think you do." Violet laughed. The sound rang false. "My dear Lydia, you sound positively theatrical." "Perhaps." Lydia reached beside her chair. From a small table she picked up an envelope. Plain, cream-coloured, unremarkable. Yet all 3 women stared at it. "There's no signature," Lydia said quietly. "But the writer appears to know a great deal." No one spoke. Lydia unfolded a sheet of paper. She read aloud. "The truth cannot remain buried forever. 3 women built their lives upon a lie. One day the village will learn what happened on the night of April 17th, 1917. The room seemed suddenly colder. Beatrice's face drained of colour. Violet's smile vanished. Even Eleanor appeared unsettled. Lydia folded the paper again. Interesting, isn't it? What nonsense, Violet said quickly. Probably some foolish prank. Perhaps. Lydia's gaze lingered on her. Though the date is accurate, nobody corrected her. Nobody denied it. For several moments only the ticking clock could be heard. Then Eleanor spoke. What do you intend to do? Nothing. You can't be serious. Oh, I am. Lydia slipped the letter back into its envelope. If someone wishes to stir up old history, let them try. The conversation resumed afterward, but not successfully. Everyone seemed distracted. Tea ended earlier than usual. As the guests departed, Lydia remained standing by the drawing-room window. She watched each woman leave. First Eleanor, then Beatrice, finally Violet. Her expression revealed nothing. Yet when the last guest disappeared down the drive, she whispered something almost too softly to hear. It has begun. That evening, the village settled into peaceful routine. Lights appeared behind curtained windows. Shopkeepers locked their doors. The church clock struck 9. At the edge of the common stood a small red telephone box. Beside it, hidden by gathering shadows, a man waited. He had been there nearly 20 minutes. He wore a dark overcoat and a flat cap pulled low over his face. When he finally moved, it was only to light a cigarette. The flare briefly illuminated sharp features. Then darkness reclaimed them. A few minutes later, another figure approached. A woman. She moved quickly and nervously. The man stepped forward. The woman stopped. "What do you want?" she asked. Her voice trembled. The man smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "You know exactly what I want." "I haven't got it." "Then find it." The woman glanced around. The village seemed deserted. "You're making a mistake." "No." The man's voice became cold. "The mistake was made 15 years ago." A long silence followed. Then he said something that caused the woman to stagger backward. "No one knows that." "Oh, I think they will." The woman turned and hurried away. The man watched her disappear. Then he crushed his cigarette beneath his shoe and vanished into the darkness. The next morning brought sunshine, birdsong, and tragedy. At 7:30, the gardener from Bracken House made a shocking discovery. A body lay beside the ornamental lake, face downward, one arm stretched awkwardly toward the water. Dead. Very dead. Within an hour, the entire village knew. By noon, speculation had spread faster than wildfire. By evening, the police had arrived. And before the week was over, Miss Marple would hear of a murder that seemed impossible to untangle. For the dead man was not a villager. Nobody admitted knowing him. Nobody could explain why he had come to Bracken Hollow. Yet hidden in his coat pocket was a folded piece of paper, a single sentence written in neat handwriting. A sentence that would change everything. It read, "Ask Lydia Ashcombe what happened on April 17th, 1917. And far away, entirely unaware that she was about to become involved, Miss Marple sat knitting beside a window and enjoying a perfectly ordinary afternoon. The peace would not last. Chapter 2. The Stranger in the Lake. The news reached Little Havisham shortly after breakfast the following morning. Miss Marple was arranging flowers in a small blue vase when Mrs. Elspeth Carrington entered the room carrying a newspaper and the unmistakable expression of someone determined to share alarming information. "My dear Jane," she announced, "there has been a murder." Miss Marple looked up pleasantly. There usually is when people say that in such a dramatic tone. Mrs. Carrington blinked. "Well, perhaps not usually." "Then where has it occurred?" "In Bracken Hollow." Miss Marple resumed arranging her flowers. "Ah, you know the village?" "No, but I know villages." That answer, as was often the case with Miss Marple, seemed to explain everything and nothing simultaneously. Mrs. Carrington settled into a chair. The body was found beside the ornamental lake at Bracken House. "Indeed? And apparently nobody knows who the man was." Miss Marple selected another flower. "That is rarely true." "What do you mean?" "My dear Elspeth, whenever people insist that nobody knows someone, it generally means somebody knows rather a lot." Mrs. Carrington considered this. "I suppose that's possible. It usually is." The matter might have ended there. But before noon, another visitor arrived. This time, it was Colonel Arthur Bantry, an old friend of Miss Marple's. He carried considerably more information. "The police have identified the victim," he announced. "Already?" said Miss Marple. "Name of Charles Mercer." The colonel sat down. "Age about 50. No local connections as far as anyone can tell. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. As far as anyone can tell. Exactly, the Colonel chuckled. You sound as though you're expecting complications. I should be disappointed without them. The Colonel leaned forward. There is something rather odd. There always is. A note was found on the body. Now Miss Marple looked interested. What sort of note? The Colonel repeated the sentence discovered in the dead man's pocket. Ask Lydia Ashcombe what happened on April 17th, 1917. For the first time, Miss Marple set down her knitting. How very direct. Quite. And Mrs. Ashcombe's reaction? The Colonel hesitated. According to rumour, she claimed she had no idea what it meant. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Rumours are wonderful things. You don't believe her? I haven't met her. Then how can you have an opinion? My dear Colonel, I don't, she paused. I merely find it interesting that someone left a message pointing directly at one person. The Colonel nodded. Why? Because murderers generally prefer confusion. Meanwhile, Bracken Hollow buzzed with speculation. The village post office had become the centre of discussion. By 10 o'clock, nearly everyone had formed a theory. By 11, they had exchanged theories. By noon, they had improved each other's theories until none resembled reality. The police, unfortunately, were forced to deal with facts. Detective Inspector Malcolm Graves arrived from the county headquarters shortly after sunrise. He was 43, methodical, and possessed a profound distrust of gossip. This placed him at an immediate disadvantage in village investigations. He spent the morning examining the lakeside where the body had been found. The victim had suffered a severe blow to the head. Death had occurred sometime after 10 o'clock the previous evening. There were footprints, several sets. Unfortunately, recent dew and soft ground had blurred them beyond usefulness. No murder weapon had been located. No witnesses had come forward. No obvious motive had appeared. Inspector Graves disliked all three circumstances. By midday, he sat in Bracken House opposite Lydia Ashcombe. The elegant drawing room seemed unchanged from the previous afternoon. Only the atmosphere differed. Lydia appeared perfectly composed. Too composed, some might have thought. The inspector opened his notebook. Mrs. Ashcombe, do you recognize the name Charles Mercer? No. You've never met him? Not to my knowledge. The inspector watched her carefully. His body was found on your property. I understand that. Can you explain how he came to be there? No. The inspector made a note. Then he removed the folded message recovered from the dead man's pocket. I believe you've already heard about this. Yes. He placed it on the table. What happened on April 17th, 1917? For a fraction of a second, something flickered in Lydia's eyes. Gone almost immediately. Yet the inspector noticed. I don't recall. That date means nothing to you. No. The inspector remained silent. People often rushed to fill silence. Lydia did not. Eventually he changed direction. 3 women visited you yesterday afternoon. Yes. Eleanor Finch. Violet Harcourt. Beatrice Wren. Correct. How long have you known them? Many years. Did any of them know Charles Mercer? I couldn't say. The inspector closed his notebook. Thank you. Lydia inclined her head. The interview was over. Yet as Graves reached the door, she spoke unexpectedly. Inspector? He turned. Yes? You're going to discover that people tell lies for many reasons. That's true. Some lie for money. The inspector nodded. Others for love. Also true. Lydia's gaze drifted briefly toward the window. And some because they believe they're protecting someone. The inspector waited. She said nothing further. A curious remark, he thought. Very curious. That afternoon he interviewed the other 3 women. Eleanor Finch proved calm and practical. She admitted receiving a letter several years earlier from an unknown sender, but insisted it had nothing to do with the current case. Inspector Graves found that statement intriguing. Beatrice Wren was considerably less composed. The mere mention of April 1917 left her visibly shaken. She denied any knowledge of Charles Mercer, yet she seemed terrified. Inspector Graves noticed that as well. Then came Violet Harcourt, the most confident of the 3, or perhaps the most skilled actress. She laughed at the suggestion that she knew the victim. A complete stranger. You've never seen him before? Never. The answer came quickly, perhaps too quickly. As he left, Graves felt increasingly certain of one thing. All 4 women were hiding something. The difficulty lay in determining whether that secret had anything to do with murder. Late that evening, another development occurred. A local constable arrived at the inspector's temporary office, carrying an object wrapped in cloth. "We found this near the old footbridge." Graves unwrapped it. Inside lay a silver cigarette case, expensive, elegant. The initials engraved upon it read, C.M. Charles Mercer. The inspector frowned. "Where exactly?" "About half a mile from Bracken House." "Hidden?" "Under some bushes." Graves turned the case over. Something rattled inside. He opened it. There were no cigarettes. Instead, folded carefully into the compartment was a small photograph. Old, faded, taken many years earlier. The inspector studied it, then sat very still. The picture showed 4 young women standing together in front of a country house. Lydia Ashcombe, Eleanor Finch, Beatrice Wren, Violet Harcourt. Much younger, of course, yet unmistakable. Across the bottom, someone had written a date in black ink, April 1917, and on the back appeared a sentence in neat handwriting. "One of us knows the truth." Inspector Graves stared at the photograph for a long moment. Then he slowly closed the cigarette case. At last, he thought, the dead man had begun speaking, and what he was saying pointed directly toward the 4 women. But which of them was lying? And what truth had survived for 15 years, waiting patiently for a body to bring it back into the light? Far away in Little Havisham, Miss Marple sat beside her lamp, knitting quietly. A letter had just arrived from an old acquaintance in Bracken Hollow. She read it once, then a second time. Finally she smiled. A very small smile, the sort that appeared whenever human nature began behaving exactly as she expected. Chapter 3. 4 Women and a Forgotten Night. The letter that arrived in Miss Marple's hands had been written by the vicar's wife of Bracken Hollow, an old acquaintance from years before. It was not a long letter. Indeed, most of it consisted of village gossip. Yet buried among the harmless observations was a detail that immediately attracted Miss Marple's attention. "The strange thing," the letter read, "is that all 4 ladies appear more frightened than grief-stricken. One would almost think the dead man had returned from the grave rather than been placed into it." Miss Marple folded the letter thoughtfully. That was a remarkably perceptive observation. Fear and grief were entirely different emotions. People often confused them. Miss Marple never did. A person who mourned a death behaved one way. A person who feared what the death might reveal behaved quite another. She suspected Bracken Hollow contained several examples of the latter. Meanwhile, Inspector Graves spent the following day examining the faded photograph found inside Charles Mercer's cigarette case. The photograph raised more questions than it answered. Why had Mercer carried it? Why had he kept it for 15 years? And most importantly, why had someone written, "One of us knows the truth"? The sentence suggested a shared secret, a secret among the 4 women. Yet secrets rarely remained shared forever. Sooner or later, one person always knew more than the others. Human nature guaranteed it. By afternoon, Graves had arranged another round of interviews. This time he intended to ask more direct questions. Eleanor Finch arrived first. She entered the police office with the calm determination of someone who disliked wasting time. Graves placed the photograph on the desk. For the first time during any interview, Eleanor appeared genuinely startled. "Where did you get that?" "It belonged to Charles Mercer." Silence. Eleanor looked at the photograph for several seconds. Then she sighed. Well?" asked Graves. "I suppose it was only a matter of time." The inspector leaned forward. "You recognize it?" "Of course. What is the significance of April 1917? Eleanor's eyes remained fixed on the picture. "When you're young, Inspector, there are moments you believe will never matter again." She paused. "Then 20 years later they arrive at your door carrying a knife. What happened in 1917? Eleanor smiled sadly. "I think you'll have to discover that yourself." The answer irritated him, but not as much as her next statement. "Be careful of assumptions, Inspector." "What assumptions?" "The obvious ones." Before he could press further, she stood and left. Beatrice Wren's interview proved even less productive. The music teacher looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. She clasped her hands so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. When shown the photograph, she nearly dropped it. "Oh, dear God." Graves observed her carefully. "You remember it?" "Yes." "What happened that night?" Beatrice shook her head. "No." Mrs. Wren, I can't. The inspector's voice softened slightly. Can't or won't. Tears appeared unexpectedly in her eyes. For several moments she struggled to compose herself. Finally she whispered, We all agreed. Agreed on what? She looked up. Fear filled her face. Pure fear. We agreed never to speak of it again. Then she refused to answer another question. The interview with Violet Harcourt was altogether different. Unlike Beatrice, Violet appeared composed. Unlike Eleanor, she appeared defensive. And unlike Lydia, she seemed actively angry. The photograph had barely touched the desk before she laughed sharply. So that's what this is about. What is it about? Ancient history. Inspector Graves watched her. Then tell me the history. No. Her answer was immediate. Why not? Because it has nothing to do with murder. The inspector studied her. People who told the truth usually provided explanations. People who lied often provided conclusions. Violet was offering conclusions, nothing more. Did Charles Mercer know about this photograph? Apparently. Did you know him? No. Again, the answer arrived too quickly. The inspector made a note. Violet noticed. Something flickered in her expression. Not fear, not guilt. Something closer to annoyance, as though events were unfolding inconveniently. That reaction troubled him more than panic would have. That evening, Inspector Graves paid another visit to Bracken House. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The sky hung low and grey above the village. Lydia Ashcombe received him in the library. Rows of books lined dark wooden shelves. A fire crackled quietly. The room smelled faintly of old paper and lavender. Graves placed the photograph upon the table. Lydia stared at it. For several seconds neither spoke. Then she said, I wondered when that would appear. The inspector sat down. Tell me about it. No. Her voice remained calm. Mrs. Ashcombe, you've already decided this photograph matters. It appears to, perhaps. She folded her hands. Or perhaps someone wants it to matter. The inspector felt his patience thinning. A man is dead. Yes. A message names you. Yes. 3 other women appear frightened of a date from 15 years ago. Also true. Graves leaned forward. Then stop protecting someone. For the first time, Lydia looked genuinely surprised, not offended, not angry, simply surprised. What makes you think I'm protecting anyone? Because every answer you've given has been designed to prevent me reaching a conclusion. Lydia considered that. Then she smiled faintly. A fair observation. Then who are you protecting? A long silence followed. The fire crackled. Rain whispered against glass. At last Lydia spoke. Inspector. Yes? Have you ever noticed how people remember tragedies? He frowned. What do you mean? They remember them differently. Her gaze drifted toward the flames. 4 people witnessed the same event. She held up 4 fingers. One remembers a face. A finger lowered. One remembers a voice. Another finger lowered. One remembers a feeling. A third finger lowered. The last remembers nothing at all because fear has erased it. Only one finger remained raised. The difficulty comes when all 4 are absolutely convinced their memory is correct. Graves listened. Is that what happened in 1917? Lydia looked at him. For a moment he thought she might finally answer. Instead she said, Good evening, Inspector. The interview was over. Later that night, long after the village had gone to sleep, someone entered the churchyard. The figure moved carefully through darkness. Rain had stopped. Mist drifted among old gravestones. The church tower loomed overhead. The person carried a lantern and a shovel. No sound disturbed the silence except the scrape of metal against earth. Minute after minute passed. The hole grew deeper. Whoever worked there appeared desperate, urgent, terrified. Eventually the shovel struck wood. The figure froze. For several seconds nothing moved. Then trembling hands brushed away damp soil. A small wooden box emerged. Not a coffin, a strong box. Old, weathered, hidden beneath the earth for many years. The figure dragged it free, opened the lid, and stared. The box was empty, completely empty. The lantern nearly fell from nervous fingers. The figure looked around wildly. Someone had already been there. Someone had taken whatever the box once contained, and whoever had removed it clearly understood its importance, because lying inside the otherwise empty box was a single folded note, nothing more. The figure opened it, read the message. and gave a small gasp of horror. Written in neat handwriting were only 5 words: "You are already too late." The following morning brought another shock. A frightened church caretaker appeared at the police station shortly after dawn. Inspector Graves listened carefully as the man described what he had discovered: the disturbed earth, the empty hole, signs of recent digging. The inspector immediately left for the churchyard. Within minutes, he stood beside the excavation site. The ground clearly showed evidence of activity. Someone had hidden something there, someone else had retrieved it, and both events appeared connected to the mystery of Charles Mercer. As Graves examined the area, a constable approached carrying an object. "Found this nearby, sir. What is it?" "A glove." The inspector took it. A woman's glove. Expensive. Elegant, and embroidered inside with a single-stitched letter. V. Violet. Or perhaps someone wanted him to think so. Either way, the mystery had just become considerably more dangerous, because somewhere in Bracken Hollow, a secret buried for 15 years had finally begun clawing its way back to the surface. And now it seemed somebody was willing to dig up the past, literally, to keep it hidden. Chapter 4. Miss Marple arrives. By Thursday morning, Bracken Hollow had become a village divided into 2 groups: those who believed the police were close to solving the murder, and those who knew perfectly well they were not. The second group was considerably larger. Inspector Graves, unfortunately, belonged to the first, or at least he wished to. The discovery of the empty strongbox beneath the churchyard seemed significant. The embroidered glove suggested a possible suspect. The photograph connected the 4 women to a shared secret, and yet none of the pieces fit together. It was like assembling a puzzle whose maker had deliberately mixed pieces from several different boxes. The more he learned, the less he understood, which was precisely when Miss Marple arrived. The journey from Little Havisham took less than an hour. Miss Marple entered Bracken Hollow shortly before noon aboard a modest motor car driven by the vicar's wife. The village appeared exactly as she expected: pretty, peaceful, and thoroughly occupied with discussing murder. Miss Marple had often observed that villages resembled ponds. Drop a pebble into the water, and every ripple eventually reached every corner. A murder was not a pebble. A murder was a cannonball. As the motor car passed along the high street, she noticed curtains moving, faces appearing briefly at windows, people pretending not to stare. All perfectly normal. Human beings possessed an endless appetite for scandal, provided it belonged to somebody else. The vicar's wife lowered her voice. "Everyone is talking about Lydia Ashcombe." Miss Marple nodded. "They usually do, when a note points directly toward someone." "You think she's guilty?" Miss Marple smiled. "My dear, I have not even met her." "That never seems to stop you." "Quite true." The vicar's wife laughed. Miss Marple spent the afternoon quietly gathering impressions. She never considered gossip a reliable source of facts, but it was an excellent source of character, and character, she believed, solved most mysteries. By 4 o'clock, she had heard at least 12 versions of recent events. Curiously, all contradicted one another, yet several patterns emerged. Everyone described Lydia Ashcombe as controlled. Everyone described Eleanor Finch as sensible. Everyone described Beatrice Wren as frightened. And everyone described Violet Harcourt as charming. The last description interested Miss Marple most. Charm was useful. Charm was dangerous. Charm frequently concealed unpleasant qualities. She had known several charming murderers. That evening, Inspector Graves received an unexpected visitor. Miss Marple entered the temporary police office carrying knitting and looking entirely harmless. This appearance had deceived many people. Inspector Graves was not among them. He had heard stories. A great many stories. "You are Miss Marple." "I am." The inspector offered a chair. "You've taken an interest in the case?" "A village friend asked me to visit." "And naturally you became curious." "Naturally." The inspector almost smiled. They studied one another briefly. Then Miss Marple spoke. "I understand 4 women are connected by an event in 1917. "Yes, 1 man is dead." "Correct." "A hidden box was emptied before the police found it." "Also correct." Miss Marple nodded. "Then I imagine everyone is concentrating on the wrong thing." The inspector stared. "Why?" "Because they usually are." He leaned back. "What do you think matters?" "The lie." "What lie?" "The one in your title." "My title?" "The title you've unconsciously given the case." Inspector Graves blinked. Miss Marple continued knitting. 3 women, 1 lie, 1 body. The inspector frowned. How do you know there was only 1 lie? Miss Marple smiled. There rarely are several important lies. 1 is usually enough. That same evening, events took a disturbing turn. Violet Harcourt received a letter. It arrived shortly before dinner. No return address, no signature. Only a single folded sheet. The handwriting was unfamiliar, yet the message caused all colour to vanish from her face. It contained only 1 sentence. You should have told the truth 15 years ago. Violet read it 3 times, then immediately carried it to the fireplace. The paper burned quickly. Within moments only ashes remained, but her hands continued trembling long afterward, because the letter confirmed something she had desperately hoped was untrue. Someone knew, not merely part of the truth, all of it. Meanwhile, Beatrice Wren sat alone in her cottage. Sleep had become almost impossible. Every creak of the floorboards startled her. Every unexpected sound made her heart race. She felt trapped between past and present, between memory and fear. At 9:30 there came a knock at the door. 3 slow knocks. Beatrice froze. Nobody visited at that hour. The knock came again. She approached cautiously. Who is it? No answer. Her fear deepened. The 3rd knock sounded louder than before. Finally she opened the door. The night beyond appeared empty. No visitor, no figure, no movement, only mist drifting across the lane. Then she noticed something. A small package resting upon the doorstep, wrapped in brown paper. Beatrice stared at it. Every instinct told her not to touch it. Unfortunately, curiosity proved stronger. She carried the parcel inside, untied the string, opened the wrapping, and nearly screamed. Inside lay a faded newspaper clipping. The date printed at the top read, April 18th, 1917. Beneath it was a headline, Local Soldier Reported Missing Beatrice's. Hands shook violently, because she recognized the name immediately. The name she had spent 15 years trying to forget. Thomas Mercer. The next morning, Inspector Graves received the clipping. Beatrice delivered it personally. She looked exhausted, almost ill. The inspector studied the article. The report was brief. A young soldier from a neighbouring county had disappeared while home on military leave. No body had ever been found. No explanation had ever emerged. Eventually, authorities assumed he had deserted, died elsewhere, or vanished voluntarily. The case had been forgotten, except by someone. Graves looked up. Who was Thomas Mercer? Beatrice hesitated, then answered softly. Charles Mercer's younger brother. The inspector sat very still. For several seconds neither spoke. At last he said, So Charles Mercer came here because of something that happened to Thomas. Beatrice nodded. Tears filled her eyes. Yes. What happened? A long silence followed. Then she whispered, That's the problem. What problem? Beatrice's expression became haunted. None of us knows exactly what happened. The answer seemed absurd, yet she appeared sincere. Inspector Graves felt the case slipping even further beyond his grasp. A missing soldier, a dead brother, 4 frightened women, a hidden box, anonymous letters, and a lie dating back to wartime. The mystery was growing larger, not smaller. That afternoon, Miss Marple finally met Lydia Ashcombe. The meeting took place in the gardens of Bracken House. The roses were in bloom, the sky was bright, birdsong drifted through the warm air, an idyllic setting, entirely unsuitable for discussing murder. Lydia greeted her politely. The 2 women walked slowly among flower beds. For several minutes they spoke only of gardening. Then Lydia said, You didn't come here to discuss roses. No, and you already have a theory. Miss Marple smiled. Several. Lydia laughed quietly. I expected as much. They continued walking. At length Miss Marple asked a simple question. Which of the 3 women are you trying to protect? Lydia stopped. For the first time since the investigation began, genuine emotion appeared on her face. Not fear, not guilt, sorrow, deep sorrow. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost a whisper. The wrong one. Miss Marple looked at her carefully. The wrong one? Lydia nodded. A distant look entered her eyes. As I discovered far too late, before Miss Marple could ask another question, a gardener came running across the lawn. His face was pale, his breathing ragged. "Mrs. Ashcombe, what is it?" The man struggled to answer. Then he finally managed the words. "There's been another attack." The garden suddenly felt colder. "Who?" asked Lydia. The gardener swallowed. "Mrs. Finch. Eleanor Finch. Someone had struck her from behind while she was walking near the old mill road. She was alive, barely, and according to the doctor, she had spoken only 3 words before losing consciousness. 3 words that would send shockwaves through the entire village. 3 words spoken again and again, as though she desperately wanted someone to understand. It wasn't Thomas. Chapter 5. The Man. Everyone buried. The attack upon Eleanor Finch transformed the atmosphere of Bracken Hollow overnight. A murder was terrible. An attempted murder during an active investigation was worse. It suggested panic, and panic, Miss Marple often observed, was one of the most revealing emotions in the world. People could lie while calm, they could deceive while comfortable, but fear had a habit of tearing holes in carefully constructed stories. By dawn the following morning, every villager knew that Eleanor Finch had been found unconscious beside the old mill road. By breakfast, half the village had decided she had been silenced because she knew too much. By luncheon, the other half had concluded she had attacked herself to attract sympathy. Neither theory impressed Inspector Graves. The doctor informed him that Eleanor's injuries were genuine. Someone had struck her hard enough to fracture part of her skull. Had the blow landed slightly differently, she would already be dead. More troubling still were the words she had spoken before losing consciousness. "It wasn't Thomas." The inspector had repeated the sentence so many times that it seemed permanently lodged inside his head. If it wasn't Thomas, then who was it? And what exactly had happened in April of 1917? Shortly after 10 o'clock, Miss Marple paid a visit to the village hospital. Eleanor remained unconscious. The small room smelled faintly of antiseptic and flowers. A nurse adjusted blankets while Miss Marple stood quietly beside the bed. The elderly detective studied the injured woman's face. People revealed surprising things while asleep. Not facts, perhaps, but character. Eleanor's expression was troubled. Not frightened, troubled, as though even unconsciousness could not entirely free her from an old burden. When the nurse left the room, Miss Marple remained staring thoughtfully. Then she noticed something, a small leather handbag resting on a nearby chair. Eleanor's belongings. The bag had been collected after the attack. The police had already examined it. Nothing suspicious had been found. Yet Miss Marple's eyes lingered on it. There was a curious bulge in one corner, not large, barely noticeable. When Inspector Graves arrived 20 minutes later, he found Miss Marple waiting outside. "You've been visiting the patient?" "Yes." "Any revelations?" "Perhaps." The inspector sighed. Miss Marple's perhapses were notorious. "What have you discovered?" "Did anyone examine the lining of Mrs. Finch's handbag?" Graves blinked. "The lining?" "Yes." The constables searched it. "The inside?" "Certainly," Miss Marple smiled. "The lining, Inspector, not the contents." Within half an hour, the handbag was brought to the police station. A closer examination revealed a hidden tear, carefully stitched, deliberately concealed. Inside lay a folded piece of paper, a very old piece of paper, yellowed with age, fragile, and dated April 1917. Inspector Graves unfolded it carefully. The document appeared to be part of a handwritten statement. Most of it had been torn away years earlier. Only a fragment remained. Yet what survived was enough to send a chill through the room. The man fell near the quarry edge. Miss Harcourt screamed, believed him dead, agreed nobody must speak. The statement ended there. The remainder was missing. For several seconds neither Graves nor Miss Marple spoke. Then the inspector looked up. The quarry. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, the old quarry outside the village. Precisely. And 4 women were involved. It would seem so. Inspector Graves folded the paper carefully. For the first time, the events of April 1917 felt tangible, real, not merely rumors and frightened silences. Someone had fallen. Someone had been believed dead, and 4 women had agreed to hide the truth. That afternoon, Graves ordered a search of the abandoned quarry. The place lay nearly a mile beyond the village. Nature had reclaimed much of it. Weeds grew between broken stones. Wildflowers covered old pathways. The quarry itself formed a vast hollow in the earth, surrounded by steep rock walls. It looked peaceful, but peaceful places often possessed unpleasant histories. Several constables spent hours searching the area. Nothing appeared unusual. No hidden documents, no weapon, no evidence. Then, shortly before evening, one of the officers shouted. The inspector hurried over. The constable stood beside a narrow crevice hidden behind dense ivy. "What is it?" "There's something down there, sir." They cleared away vegetation. A small cavity emerged, almost invisible unless one knew where to look. Inside rested an old metal tin. Rust covered much of its surface. The lid resisted opening. Eventually, Graves forced it loose. The contents consisted of several papers wrapped in cloth. Most had deteriorated beyond recognition. One, however, remained readable. The inspector unfolded it. His eyes widened, then narrowed, because he was holding a newspaper from April 1917. And across the front page, someone had written 3 words in dark ink. He was alive. The discovery spread through the investigation like fire through dry grass. The implications were impossible to ignore. If the man involved in the quarry incident had survived, then the 4 women had not hidden a death. They had hidden something else. Something potentially far worse. Miss Marple listened carefully as Inspector Graves explained the find. "He was alive," she repeated. "Yes." "Interesting." The inspector frowned. "Interesting? My dear inspector, everyone has assumed a death occurred in 1917. Naturally. And now we discover the opposite." She resumed knitting. "Assumptions are dangerous creatures." That evening, Lydia Ashcombe received another visitor. This time it was Violet Harcourt. The younger woman arrived visibly agitated. The moment the door closed behind her, she spoke. "You should tell them." Lydia looked up from her book. "No." "For heaven's sake, Lydia." "No." Violet began pacing. The elegant composure she usually displayed had vanished completely. "They'll discover everything." "Perhaps. They already know about the quarry." Lydia remained calm. "They know part of it. That's enough." "No." Violet stopped. "What do you mean?" Lydia's gaze settled upon her. Steady, uncomfortable. The kind of gaze that seemed to strip away pretenses. "They know the wrong story." For several moments, silence filled the room. Then Violet laughed nervously. "What does that mean?" Lydia continued, watching her. And suddenly Violet looked away. The movement lasted only a second, yet it did not escape notice. Lydia saw it, and so would Miss Marple have. The guilty often looked away first. Later that night, Miss Marple sat alone in her guest room. A small lamp illuminated her knitting. Outside, rain tapped softly against the window. She was thinking about Thomas Mercer. Or rather, she was thinking about everyone else's thoughts concerning Thomas Mercer. There was a difference. The entire investigation revolved around him, his disappearance, his brother's return, the events at the quarry. Yet something felt wrong. Not impossible, simply wrong, like a familiar face wearing the wrong expression. Miss Marple had experienced the sensation before, and it usually meant one thing: everyone was looking in the wrong direction. At 11:30, a sudden knock interrupted her thoughts. The vicar's wife entered, looking alarmed. "Jane." "Yes?" "A constable just arrived." Miss Marple set down her knitting. "What has happened?" The answer arrived immediately. Someone broke into Beatrice Wren's cottage. Miss Marple rose. "Was anything stolen?" The vicar's wife swallowed. "Apparently not." "Then what did they want?" The woman hesitated. "They left something." Less than an hour later, Inspector Graves stood inside Beatrice's sitting room. The frightened music teacher sat wrapped in a blanket. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. The cottage showed clear signs of intrusion. A rear window had been forced open. Drawers emptied. Cupboards searched. Papers scattered everywhere. Yet nothing appeared missing. The intruder had come for something specific, and apparently had not found it. On the dining table rested the object left behind. A single photograph. Old, faded, taken in 1917. Inspector Graves stared at it. Miss Marple stared at it. Beatrice stared at it. Because unlike the first photograph, this one contained 5 people. The 4 women stood together near the quarry, and beside them stood a young man in military uniform, Thomas Mercer, alive, smiling, looking directly at the camera. Across the bottom, someone had written a message. Not recently, years ago, perhaps even the very day the picture had been taken. The words were simple, yet deeply unsettling. "If anything happens to me, ask Violet." The room fell silent. Inspector Graves slowly lowered the photograph. For the first time since arriving in Bracken Hollow, he felt certain of one thing. The mystery was no longer centered upon Lydia Ashcombe, nor Eleanor Finch, nor terrified Beatrice Wren. It had just shifted dramatically, and every road now seemed to lead toward Violet Harcourt. Whether she was victim, witness, or killer remained to be seen. But somewhere behind her carefully maintained charm lay a truth that had survived 15 years. A truth someone was now willing to kill for. Chapter 6. The Woman in the Photograph. The photograph changed everything. By the following morning, Inspector Graves found himself confronting an uncomfortable reality. For days, the investigation had revolved around questions. Now it revolved around a person. Violet Harcourt, the smiling young woman standing beside Thomas Mercer in the faded photograph. The woman whose name Thomas himself had apparently written beneath the image. "If anything happens to me, ask Violet." It was the first direct message from the past, and it pointed nowhere else, only to her. Unfortunately, people who held the answers were often the people least willing to provide them. Violet received the inspector in the drawing room of her cottage. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains. Fresh flowers stood on a side table. Everything appeared tasteful and orderly. Yet Graves noticed signs of strain. A half-empty teacup, a cigarette burned almost entirely to ash, and dark circles beneath Violet's eyes. The composed, charming woman of previous interviews seemed exhausted. The inspector placed the photograph on the table. Violet stared at it. For several moments she said nothing. Then she closed her eyes. Not dramatically, not theatrically. Simply as someone might close a door they could no longer hold open. "You found it." "Yes." Her voice sounded distant. "I wondered when that would happen." The inspector sat opposite her. "Then perhaps it's time you told me the truth." A faint smile appeared. Not amusement. Regret. "The truth." She repeated the word softly, as though there is only one version. "There usually is." "No, Inspector." She looked up. "And that is where people make mistakes." The answer reminded him uncomfortably of Lydia Ashcombe. The same caution, the same reluctance, the same sense that everyone involved was circling something enormous without touching it directly. "Did you know Thomas Mercer?" "Yes." The admission came immediately. At last, a straightforward answer. "We were friends." "Only friends?" Violet hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." The pause was brief, yet Graves noticed it. He noticed everything. What happened at the quarry? For the first time, genuine fear entered her eyes. Not fear of arrest, not fear of scandal. Something deeper, older, the fear of memory. "We believed he was dead." The inspector remained perfectly still. "Go on." Violet looked away. Toward the window, toward the bright morning beyond, toward anywhere except the past. "It was April." Her voice grew softer. "Thomas was home on military leave." She swallowed. "We met at the quarry after sunset." "Who met?" "All 5 of us." The inspector's pulse quickened. For days he had been searching for this moment. The first complete account. What happened? Violet clasped her hands tightly. "There was an argument." "About what?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't know." "You were there." "Yes." "Then you know." "No." Her voice sharpened unexpectedly. "You don't understand." The inspector said nothing. Violet leaned forward. The argument wasn't important. Then what was? The fall. Silence. The room seemed smaller suddenly, more confined. Violet continued. Thomas stepped backward. Her face had grown pale. There was loose stone. He fell. "Yes." "Into the quarry." "Yes." The word emerged barely above a whisper. The inspector waited. What happened next? For several seconds, Violet simply stared at the photograph. Then she said, "We thought he was dead." That afternoon, Inspector Graves gathered the remaining women. Lydia Ashcombe, Beatrice Wren, and, despite her condition, Eleanor Finch, who had regained consciousness that morning. The meeting took place in the library at Bracken House. Rain clouds hung low outside. The atmosphere inside was equally stormy. No one appeared comfortable. No one appeared eager to be there. The inspector placed the photograph in the center of the table. "You've all seen this." Nobody answered. He continued, "Mrs. Harcourt has admitted Thomas Mercer fell at the quarry." Beatrice closed her eyes. Eleanor stared at the floor. Only Lydia remained composed. She also says everyone believed he was dead. Again silence. The inspector's voice hardened. For God's sake, one of you tell me what happened after the fall. It was Eleanor who finally spoke. We climbed down. Everyone turned toward her. The injured woman looked tired, yet there was determination in her expression. We found him lying among the rocks. Her hands trembled slightly. There was blood. The room remained utterly silent. We couldn't wake him. The inspector listened carefully. What then? Eleanor looked at Lydia, then Beatrice, then Violet, as though seeing ghosts. We panicked. The word seemed absurdly small. Panic. Such a harmless word for something that had apparently ruined multiple lives. We were young, Eleanor continued. Frightened. Of what? She laughed bitterly. Everything. The answer sounded sincere, which made it all the more disturbing. We thought people would blame us. The inspector frowned. For an accident? No. Eleanor's eyes filled with sadness. Because it wasn't entirely an accident. The room froze. Graves leaned forward. What does that mean? But before she could answer, Lydia spoke. No. Everyone turned. Lydia's voice remained calm. Too calm. Eleanor. The older woman met her gaze. Don't. Something passed silently between them. A shared understanding. A warning. Perhaps both. Then Eleanor looked away and said nothing further. That evening, Miss Marple sat with Lydia in the garden. The roses moved gently in the breeze. For a long while, neither woman spoke. Then Miss Marple broke the silence. It wasn't an accident. Lydia smiled faintly. No, yet it wasn't murder either. The smile vanished. For the first time, Lydia appeared genuinely surprised. You know that already? My dear. Miss Marple adjusted her knitting. I've known it for 2 days. Lydia laughed softly. A tired laugh. The kind produced by relief rather than amusement. Then perhaps you're ahead of everyone else. Not quite. Miss Marple studied her. I still don't know what happened after the fall. Lydia looked toward the distant hills. Neither answered nor denied. Which, Miss Marple reflected, was answer enough. Later that night, another person received a visitor. Beatrice Wren sat alone in her cottage when she heard footsteps outside. Slow footsteps. Measured. Deliberate. Not attempting concealment. The sound stopped beside the front door. Then came a knock. 3 times. Exactly as before. Beatrice's heart nearly stopped. The same knock. The same terrifying rhythm. She remained frozen. The knock came again. And then a voice. A man's voice. Soft. Calm. Almost polite. Miss Wren. Beatrice felt cold from head to toe. Because she recognized it. Not completely. Not consciously. Yet something deep inside her memory recognized it. The voice continued. I think it's time we spoke. Beatrice backed away from the door. The visitor waited, then spoke again, and this time the words struck her like a physical blow. Thomas would have wanted that. A small cry escaped her lips. The voice, the phrasing, the manner. Suddenly she remembered. Not from yesterday, not from last year, from 15 years ago. The visitor outside sounded exactly like Charles Mercer. Exactly. Half an hour later, Inspector Graves arrived at the cottage. The visitor was gone. No trace remained. No footprints, no evidence, nothing, except Beatrice herself. Terrified beyond reason, she sat, shaking beside the fire, unable to stop trembling. Graves crouched beside her. Miss Wren. She looked up. Her face was white. What happened? For several moments she could not answer. Then finally she whispered, It can't be. What can't be? Her eyes filled with tears, the kind born from pure confusion. The man outside. Yes? Beatrice swallowed hard, then spoke the words that silenced the room. The man outside wasn't Charles Mercer. Inspector Graves frowned. How do you know? Beatrice stared into the fire, into memories she had spent 15 years trying to bury. When she finally answered, her voice was barely audible. Because Charles Mercer was with us that night. The inspector felt every thought in his mind stop at once. With you? Beatrice nodded. Slowly, mechanically, as though each movement required effort. At the quarry, silence. A deep, profound silence. The kind that arrives when an entire investigation suddenly shifts beneath your feet. Inspector Graves stared at her, unable to speak, unable to think. Because if Charles Mercer had been present in 1917, then everything they believed about the case was wrong. Every assumption, every theory, every conclusion, and somewhere in Bracken Hollow, a killer was relying upon those mistakes. Chapter 7. The second Mercer, Inspector Graves, did not sleep that night. By 3 o'clock in the morning he was still seated at his desk, staring at the growing collection of photographs, statements, letters, and notes spread before him. For the first time since arriving in Bracken Hollow, he felt as though he had been investigating the wrong mystery. Not completely wrong, but wrong enough. The revelation from Beatrice Wren refused to leave his mind. Charles Mercer was with us that night. The statement overturned everything. According to every known account, the mystery began with Thomas Mercer's disappearance in April 1917. Charles Mercer, the dead man found beside the lake, had supposedly arrived years later seeking answers. A grieving brother searching for the truth. A simple story, a believable story. And therefore, Miss Marple would have said, exactly the sort of story one should distrust. Simple stories rarely survived contact with reality. At breakfast, Inspector Graves paid a visit to Miss Marple. He found her in the vicarage garden, feeding crumbs to a robin. The bird appeared entirely comfortable in her company. Inspector Graves envied it. "I have a problem." Miss Marple smiled. "Only one?" "Several. That's more normal." The inspector sat down. "Beatrice insists Charles Mercer was present at the quarry in 1917. "Yes." "You don't seem surprised." "I am not." Graves stared. "You knew." "No." "Then why aren't you surprised?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Because everybody has been discussing Thomas Mercer for days." "Naturally. And almost nobody has discussed Charles." The inspector frowned. "What does that mean?" "My dear inspector, whenever one person receives all the attention, I begin looking at the person standing beside them." The robin hopped away. Miss Marple watched it go. "People are wonderfully predictable." Meaning that if Thomas disappeared, everyone would naturally focus upon Thomas." She paused. "But what if the important man was Charles?" By midday, Graves had arranged for a deeper investigation into the Mercer family. The original records came from a nearby county. Many had been forgotten. Others had been misplaced. A few had never been examined properly at all. After several frustrating hours, a constable arrived carrying a thin file. The inspector opened it immediately. Within minutes, he found something interesting, then something alarming, then something extraordinary. He read the documents twice, then a third time. Finally, he sat back in silence. Because according to official records, Thomas Mercer had not been the only Mercer home on leave during April 1917. Charles Mercer had been there too. The brothers had spent nearly 2 weeks together, yet not a single witness in Bracken Hollow had ever mentioned that fact. Not one. Someone had deliberately erased Charles from the story. That afternoon, Graves returned to Bracken House. This time he requested only Lydia Ashcombe. The moment she entered the library, she knew something had changed. Inspector Graves could see it. People often sensed when a secret was approaching exposure. Lydia sat down calmly. "Well?" The inspector placed the military records on the table. For the first time since he had met her, Lydia looked genuinely unsettled. Not frightened, not panicked. Simply tired, very tired. "You found it?" "Yes." A long silence followed. Then Graves spoke. "Both brothers were here." "Yes." "You knew that?" "Yes." "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Lydia looked toward the window. "Because we were never protecting Thomas." The words hung in the air, heavy, unavoidable. The inspector remained motionless. "What?" Lydia closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. "We spent 15 years talking about Thomas, because it was easier." "Easier than what?" "Easier than talking about Charles." For several seconds neither spoke. Finally Graves asked the question that had begun forming in his mind. "What did Charles do?" Lydia's expression changed. Not guilt, not fear, disappointment. The sort felt toward someone once admired, someone who had failed. "He lied." The inspector almost laughed. "After everything that's happened, that hardly seems significant." Lydia met his gaze. It was. Meanwhile, Miss Marple paid another visit to Beatrice Wren. The music teacher looked exhausted. The events of recent days had aged her visibly. She poured tea with trembling hands. Miss Marple accepted a cup. Neither woman spoke for several moments. Then Miss Marple asked, "Were you in love with Thomas Mercer?" The teacup slipped slightly. Tea splashed onto the saucer. Beatrice stared. Miss Marple waited patiently. At length Beatrice nodded. Once. Very slightly. There. Miss Marple smiled gently. "That explains a great deal." Beatrice looked down. "We were young." "Yes. And war makes people foolish. Often." The older woman's eyes filled with sadness. "I thought I would marry him." Miss Marple said nothing. Sometimes silence encouraged honesty better than questions. Beatrice continued. "Then Charles arrived." The sentence was quiet, yet Miss Marple felt a small click somewhere inside her mind, like a key turning in a lock. Not the entire solution, but part of it, an important part. What happened then? Beatrice's face became pale. "No. Miss Wren, no." Her voice sharpened unexpectedly. "I can't." The reaction itself told Miss Marple more than the answer would have. That evening, Eleanor Finch finally left the hospital, against medical advice, against common sense, and against the wishes of nearly everyone around her. She insisted upon returning home. The doctor protested, the nurses protested, Inspector Graves protested. None succeeded. Eleanor Finch possessed the stubbornness of a woman who had spent half a century ignoring unwanted advice. By sunset, she was back in her cottage, alone, or so she believed. At approximately 8 o'clock, she heard a sound from the garden. A gate opening, then closing. Slowly, deliberately. Eleanor froze. Someone was outside. She moved toward the window, carefully, quietly, then parted the curtain. A figure stood near the rose bushes, watching the house. The gathering darkness concealed most details. Yet she immediately recognized the silhouette. Recognition struck like lightning. Not uncertainty, not suspicion. Recognition. Her breath caught. No. The word escaped before she could stop it. Outside, the figure turned and walked away, not hurriedly, not furtively, as though it knew she had seen it and wanted her to. The following morning, Eleanor arrived at Bracken House before breakfast. Lydia found her waiting in the drawing room. Neither woman spoke immediately. They had known each other too long for unnecessary introductions. Finally, Lydia broke the silence. "You look dreadful." Eleanor ignored the observation. "I saw someone last night." Lydia's expression remained unchanged. "Who?" Eleanor hesitated, then answered. The name caused even Lydia Ashcombe to lose colour. "For the first time since the investigation began." "For the first time? You are certain?" "Yes." "That's impossible." "I know." Silence followed. The clock ticked softly. Outside, birds sang. Inside, neither woman moved. At last Lydia whispered, "Then God help us." That afternoon, Inspector Graves received the results of another search. This time, the discovery came from the abandoned quarry. A section of loose rock had collapsed during the previous evening's rain. Behind it, workers uncovered something hidden within a narrow cavity. Not a body, not a weapon, a diary. Small, leather-bound, remarkably well preserved. The cover bore no name, no initials, nothing. Yet when Graves opened the first page, his pulse quickened immediately. The handwriting was neat, careful, and dated April 1917. The inspector turned several pages, then stopped, because he had found an entry written only hours before the quarry incident, an entry signed with a single name, Charles. For several seconds he stared, then began reading. The first lines appeared ordinary enough. Observations about the village, the war, his brother, the weather. Then, near the bottom of the page, came a sentence that changed everything. A sentence so unexpected that Graves reread it 3 times. To ensure he had not misunderstood, the diary entry stated, "Thomas still believes Violet loves him. I pray he never learns the truth." Inspector Graves slowly closed the diary. Outside, storm clouds gathered over Bracken Hollow. Inside, the case shifted once again. Because secrets involving death were one thing, secrets involving love were another, and in Miss Marple's experience, the second kind often proved far more dangerous. Chapter 8. The fourth name in the ledger. The following morning dawned beneath a veil of silver mist. Larkspur Cove seemed quieter than usual, as though the village itself had become uneasy. Word of the investigation had spread beyond every drawing room and garden gate. Curtains twitched whenever Inspector Graves passed. Conversations stopped abruptly in the post office. Even the fishermen on the harbour spoke in lowered voices. Everyone knew the same thing. Miss Marple was close to something. No one knew what. And that uncertainty frightened people more than certainty ever could. Miss Marple spent the morning seated near the window of Rosebank Cottage with a blanket over her knees and several notebooks spread across a small table. Inspector Graves arrived shortly after 10. He looked tired. "Good morning, Miss Marple, Inspector." He removed his hat. "I hardly slept." "Neither did I." That surprised him. "You?" "Oh yes. Sometimes when a puzzle refuses to arrange itself properly, sleep becomes quite impossible." She pointed toward a chair. "Sit down." Graves obeyed. Miss Marple folded her hands. "Tell me, Inspector, what do we know with absolute certainty?" He frowned. "Well," she waited. "At least start with the facts." Graves thought carefully. "Margaret Harcourt was murdered." "Yes." "She was struck with a heavy object." "Yes." "She had recently received anonymous letters." "Yes." "She was preparing to reveal something publicly." "Correct." "She trusted very few people." Miss Marple nodded. "Continue." He sighed. "Clara, Edith, and Beatrice all lied about important matters." "Indeed. But none of their lies seem large enough to justify murder." "Quite." Graves rubbed his forehead. "That is exactly what troubles me." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because we are looking at 3 lies." "Yes. And yet perhaps there were 4. The inspector looked up. "4?" "Yes." She opened a notebook. "Tell me, Inspector, have we ever established exactly why Margaret kept that private ledger?" Graves blinked. "The one found hidden in her desk." "Yes. We assumed it contained records of village donations." "We assumed." Miss Marple emphasized the word gently. "Assumptions are dangerous creatures." She produced a folded paper. "I borrowed the ledger again this morning." Graves leaned forward. "What did you find?" "A name." "A name?" "A 4th name." His eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple opened the paper. Several entries had been copied neatly. Most were ordinary. Small charitable contributions, community funds, church repairs, nothing unusual. Then she pointed toward a page near the end. One name appeared repeatedly. Not Clara, not Edith, not Beatrice. Another entirely. Eleanor Finch. Inspector Graves frowned. "The widow who lives near the lighthouse." "The same. That cannot be important." "Can it not?" "She barely knew Margaret." Miss Marple smiled. "Did she?" The inspector hesitated. That answer suddenly felt less certain. Miss Marple tapped the page. "Notice these entries. Several sums of money had been recorded over 5 years, always linked to Eleanor Finch, always accompanied by a tiny symbol, a small black star." "Do you know what that means?" Graves asked. "No." "Then how does it help?" "Because Margaret never marked any other entries this way." The inspector stared and slowly began to understand. Margaret had been tracking something. Not donations, not village accounts, something personal, something secret, something involving Eleanor Finch. "Good heavens," he murmured. "Quite." That afternoon they visited Eleanor Finch. The widow lived alone in a weather-beaten house overlooking the sea. She was a woman in her 60s, quiet, reserved, sharp-eyed. When Miss Marple and Graves arrived, she seemed unsurprised. "Come in." Her voice carried a curious weariness. The sitting room smelled faintly of lavender and coal smoke. Miss Marple sat carefully. Inspector Graves remained standing. Eleanor regarded them both. "You wish to discuss Margaret?" "Yes," said Miss Marple. A shadow crossed the widow's face. "I imagined you might." Miss Marple watched her closely. "You knew her well?" "No." The answer came too quickly. Miss Marple noticed. So did Graves. Eleanor looked toward the window. "The village always imagined we were friends." "Were you?" "No." "Why not?" Silence. The widow's fingers tightened around a teacup. "Because some friendships end." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Did yours end happily?" "No." The answer emerged almost as a whisper. For a long moment nobody spoke. Then Miss Marple quietly produced the copied ledger page. Eleanor froze. Colour drained from her face. The reaction lasted only a second, but it was enough. Miss Marple had seen it, Inspector Graves had seen it, and Eleanor knew they had. The widow closed her eyes. "Oh, dear." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "Those entries concern you?" "Yes." "What do they mean?" Eleanor looked exhausted, as though carrying a burden she had borne for many years. Finally she spoke. "Margaret kept records." "Records of what?" The widow stared into the fire. "Promises." Neither investigator interrupted. "Many years ago," Eleanor continued, "before my husband died, there was an accident." Miss Marple listened carefully. "A boating accident?" "Yes." "Someone was hurt?" "No." Eleanor swallowed. "Someone disappeared." The room fell silent. Inspector Graves felt a chill. "A disappearance?" he asked. "Yes." "Who?" The widow hesitated, then spoke a name neither had heard before. "Daniel Wren." Miss Marple remained motionless. "Who was he?" "A traveller." "From the village?" "No." "What happened?" Eleanor's hands trembled. "He vanished." "Into the sea." That was the official explanation. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Graves. Official explanations often concealed inconvenient truths. "Margaret knew about this?" she asked. "Yes." "How?" "Because she was there." The room seemed suddenly colder. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Margaret witnessed the disappearance?" "Yes." Inspector Graves spoke. "Was Daniel Wren murdered?" Eleanor stared at him. A long silence followed. Then, "I don't know." The answer sounded truthful, which somehow made it more disturbing. When they left the cottage, neither spoke for several minutes. The sea crashed below the cliffs. Wind pulled at their coats. Finally Graves stopped walking. "This changes everything." "Yes." "A disappearance?" "Yes." "Possibly connected to Margaret?" "Yes." "Possibly connected to murder?" Miss Marple nodded. "Quite possibly." The inspector ran a hand through his hair. "For heaven's sake, why has nobody mentioned this before?" "Because old secrets grow roots." He stared at her. Meaning that after enough years people stop seeing them. Miss Marple looked toward the grey horizon. "The village has spent decades walking around something buried." "What exactly?" "That," said Miss Marple softly, "is the question." Late that evening, another discovery emerged. Sergeant Bell arrived at Rosebank Cottage carrying a small parcel. "Found this behind a loose panel in Margaret's study." Miss Marple opened it carefully. Inside lay several letters tied with faded ribbon. Very old letters, 20 years old. Most were ordinary, until she reached the final one. The handwriting instantly caught her attention. Neat, elegant, and unmistakably familiar. Miss Marple had seen it before. Very recently, her eyes widened. Inspector Graves noticed. "What is it?" She compared the writing against another document lying on the table. Slowly, carefully, twice, then a third time. There could be no mistake. The handwriting matched perfectly. Graves leaned forward. "Miss Marple?" She looked up. For the first time in days there was certainty in her expression. Not complete certainty, but enough. Enough to glimpse the shape of the truth. Enough to see how one lie had become three. How 3 women had become suspects. And how one body had appeared in Hawthorne House. The killer had not yet been proven. But at last Miss Marple believed she knew where to look. She folded the letter, placed it back into the parcel, and quietly said, "I think, Inspector, we have finally found the thread." Outside, the sea wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in Larkspur Cove, a murderer unknowingly moved one step closer to exposure. Chapter 9. The Lie That Belonged to All Three. The following day brought rain. Not the cheerful summer rain that freshens gardens and fills bird baths, but a steady grey drizzle that wrapped Larkspur Cove in melancholy. The harbour disappeared behind curtains of mist. The sea became a sheet of dull steel, and throughout the village a curious tension lingered. People sensed that something was approaching, though they could not have explained what. At Rosebank Cottage, Miss Marple sat before the fire with Inspector Graves and Sergeant Bell. The parcel of old letters lay open upon the table. Beside it rested Margaret Harcourt's ledger, and next to that, a collection of witness statements gathered over the previous week. For nearly an hour nobody spoke. Miss Marple simply studied the documents, reading, comparing, turning pages, returning to passages she had already examined. Inspector Graves finally broke the silence. "You know something?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A little. A little? A little often becomes a great deal." Graves sighed. You have reached a conclusion, haven't you? Not entirely, but close. Yes, the inspector leaned forward. Then help me understand. Miss Marple folded her hands. Inspector, tell me what has troubled you most about this case. He frowned. The lies. Which lies? All of them. She nodded. Exactly. Graves blinked. That doesn't help. Oh, I think it does. She rose carefully and walked toward the window. Rain tapped softly against the glass. For days we have been examining 3 separate deceptions. Clara's secret debt. Yes. Edith's forged references. Yes. Beatrice's hidden engagement. Yes. And none of them explain murder. Precisely, Miss Marple turned. Because they were never the important lies. The inspector stared. What do you mean? The 3 women told different lies. Yes. But they were all protecting the same truth. The room became still. Even Sergeant Bell stopped taking notes. Graves slowly stood. The same truth. Yes. The same secret. Yes. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. A secret that began 20 years ago. By noon, they had returned to Hawthorne House. The old manor felt different now. Not haunted, not sinister, merely tired, as though exhausted from carrying too many memories. The surviving residents gathered reluctantly in the drawing room. Clara Wentworth sat rigidly near the fireplace. Edith Lane occupied a chair by the window. Beatrice Holloway stood beside a bookshelf. None appeared comfortable. Miss Marple noticed. Good, uncomfortable people often reveal things. Inspector Graves addressed them. We need clarification regarding an event that occurred approximately 20 years ago. Immediate silence. A silence so sudden that it was almost an answer. Miss Marple observed all 3 women carefully. Clara's fingers tightened. Edith looked away. Beatrice turned pale. Interesting. Very interesting, Miss Marple spoke softly. Do any of you remember a man named Daniel Wren? The effect was extraordinary. Clara inhaled sharply. Edith's face lost colour. Beatrice closed her eyes. Nobody answered. Inspector Graves looked from one to the other. Well? Still silence. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Exactly as she expected. You do remember him, Clara finally spoke. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. That was years ago. Yes, he has nothing to do with this. Are you certain? No answer. Miss Marple continued. Daniel Wren arrived in the village during the summer of 1924. Nobody corrected her. Shortly afterward he disappeared. Still silence. Margaret Harcourt was present on the evening he vanished. Clara stared at the floor. Edith was present. Edith remained motionless. Beatrice was present. The younger woman swallowed. And so, said Miss Marple quietly, were all 3 of you. The room felt suddenly airless. Inspector Graves now understood. The secret, the common thread. The reason the 3 women had behaved so strangely. They were connected, not by Margaret's murder, by something older, something buried, something they had never wanted uncovered. The first to break was Edith, perhaps because she had carried guilt longest, perhaps because she was simply tired. Either way, tears filled her eyes. We didn't kill him, Miss Marple said nothing. Edith gripped the arms of her chair. We didn't. Tell us what happened. The woman looked toward Clara, then Beatrice. Neither stopped her. At last Edith spoke. Daniel Wren came to the village pretending to be a businessman. Pretending? Asked Graves. Yes. What was he really? A blackmailer. The inspector frowned. Blackmailer? Edith nodded. He collected secrets. Miss Marple was unsurprised. Such men existed in every generation, predators who lived upon the weaknesses of others. He learned things about several families, Edith continued. Important things? Yes. Dangerous things? Yes. The answer emerged instantly. Miss Marple listened carefully. Daniel Wren had threatened people, demanded money, demanded favours, promised public humiliation if denied. A familiar story, an ugly one. And Margaret knew this, asked Graves. Yes. What happened the night he disappeared? Again silence. Then Clara answered. There was an argument. A serious one? Yes. Who argued with him? Clara looked away. All of us. The truth emerged slowly, piece by piece. 20 years earlier, Daniel Wren had summoned 4 women to an abandoned boathouse near the shore. Margaret, Clara, Edith, Beatrice. Each possessed a secret. Each feared exposure. and Wren intended to profit from it. The confrontation became heated. Voices rose, threats followed. Then something happened, something nobody could describe clearly. A shove, a stumble, a fall. Daniel Wren struck his head, hard, very hard. The women believed he was dead. Panic followed. Terrible panic. No police, no doctor, no investigation, only fear. Together they carried the body toward the sea. And when morning came, Daniel Wren had vanished. Officially lost, officially drowned, officially forgotten. But not truly forgotten. Never truly forgotten. Because Margaret had remembered. For 20 years. Inspector Graves looked stunned. My God. Clara stared into the fire. We were young. Edith wiped tears away. We were frightened. Beatrice spoke at last. We thought our lives would be destroyed. Miss Marple regarded them calmly. And were they? No one answered. Because all three knew the truth. Their lives had not been destroyed. Yet the fear had ruled them for decades. Fear had become secrecy. Secrecy had become guilt. And guilt had become lies. One lie shared among three women. The lie that gave the story its shape. The lie that had hidden beneath everything. But Miss Marple knew something still did not fit. One vital piece remained missing. She looked toward the old grandfather clock, then toward the letters recovered from Margaret's study. Finally she spoke. You are telling the truth now. Clara nodded. Yes, but not the whole truth. The room froze. Beatrice's expression changed first, only slightly. Yet enough, Miss Marple noticed. So did Inspector Graves. There's more, he said. Nobody answered. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. Daniel Wren is not the reason Margaret was murdered. The three women looked startled. Then what is? Clara asked. Miss Marple turned toward the window. Rain streamed down the glass. The answer had been growing clearer all day. Daniel Wren, the letters, the ledger, the handwriting, the fourth name, the hidden records. One final contradiction remained. And contradictions were where killers made mistakes. She looked back at Inspector Graves. I believe, she said quietly, that Daniel Wren never died that night. The room exploded into stunned silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Even the rain seemed to stop. Inspector Graves stared at her. What? Miss Marple's eyes were calm. Because if he had died, Inspector... She picked up the old letter discovered in Margaret's study. He could not possibly have written this. And for the first time, genuine fear appeared on every face in the room. Because somewhere in the shadows of the past, a man everyone believed dead might have been alive all along. Chapter 10. 3 women, 1 lie, 1 body. The storm arrived during the night. By morning, Larkspur Cove lay beneath a sky the colour of old pewter. Wind swept across the harbour, rattling shutters and bending the tall grass along the cliffs. Inside Hawthorne House, however, the atmosphere was stranger than the weather. Everyone had gathered. Inspector Graves, Sergeant Bell, Clara Wentworth, Edith Lane, Beatrice Holloway, Eleanor Finch, and several curious members of the village who had been invited to witness what Inspector Graves described as the final clarification of matters. Miss Marple sat quietly beside the fireplace. A knitting bag rested at her feet. To all appearances, she seemed harmless. The appearance was deceptive. Inspector Graves cleared his throat. Miss Marple believes she has solved the murder of Margaret Harcourt. An uneasy silence followed. Outside, the wind howled around the old manor. Inside, nobody moved. Miss Marple folded her hands. My dear friends, this case has appeared remarkably complicated. A few nervous glances were exchanged. 3 women lied. She looked toward Clara, Edith, and Beatrice. A dead blackmailer seemed to have returned from the grave. She nodded toward Eleanor Finch. And hidden letters, secret ledgers, and long-forgotten events have obscured the truth. She smiled gently. Yet human nature is rarely as complicated as people imagine. Inspector Graves leaned forward. Miss Marple continued. 20 years ago, Daniel Wren attempted to blackmail several women in this village. No one disputed it. The confrontation at the boathouse was real. Again, silence. He was injured. Clara lowered her eyes. But he was not killed. A visible shudder passed through the room. Miss Marple turned to Inspector Graves. You located the doctor who treated a stranger in Brighton 3 days after the incident? Graves nodded. Yes. The room stirred. The description matched Daniel Wren exactly. Miss Marple smiled. Indeed, the supposed corpse had never been a corpse at all. Daniel Wren had survived. Disoriented and injured, certainly, but alive. Very much alive. The women had assumed they had killed him. They had not. Instead, Wren had vanished voluntarily. A man with enemies often finds disappearance convenient, especially a blackmailer, especially one wishing to begin anew elsewhere. Miss Marple looked around the room, and for 20 years nobody learned the truth, until Margaret Harcourt. The victim had discovered evidence proving Daniel Wren survived, evidence hidden among old correspondence, evidence she had begun investigating shortly before her death. That was the true danger. Not the events of 1924, the discovery made in 1944. The room grew still. Inspector Graves spoke. Margaret was planning to reveal her findings. Yes. Publicly? Yes. And someone feared that revelation. Precisely. Miss Marple reached into her bag. She withdrew several letters. The crucial clue was handwriting. Every eye followed the papers. These letters were supposedly written by different people over many years. She placed them carefully on a table. Yet they share identical characteristics. Inspector Graves nodded. The same hand. The same hand. Miss Marple turned slowly. Her gaze settled upon one person. Not Clara. Not Edith. Not Beatrice. Not Eleanor. The room seemed to hold its breath. Finally, Miss Marple spoke. Margaret Harcourt was murdered by Eleanor Finch. For several seconds, nobody reacted. The accusation seemed almost impossible. Then Eleanor laughed. A short, bitter laugh. How extraordinary. No, said Miss Marple quietly. Only logical. Inspector Graves watched the widow closely. Eleanor's expression had become unreadable. Miss Marple continued. You knew Daniel Wren better than anyone realized. Silence. He was not merely a traveller. Still silence. He was your brother. The effect was immediate. Several people gasped. Eleanor did not. That alone was revealing. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, Daniel Wren was not his real name. The widow stared into the fire. He arrived under an assumed identity. Miss Marple continued. When he disappeared, you alone knew he survived. No denial came. You maintained contact with him for years. Still no denial. The Black Star entries in Margaret's ledger recorded payments connected to that secret. Inspector Graves suddenly understood. The money? Yes. Miss Marple nodded. Margaret discovered Eleanor had been quietly supporting her brother for decades. Eleanor finally spoke. He was ill. Her voice sounded tired, very tired. Nobody would have helped him. Perhaps not, said Miss Marple. But Margaret learned the truth. The widow closed her eyes. Yes. She intended to expose it. Yes. The single word barely emerged. The room remained silent. Miss Marple continued gently. Margaret arranged the village gathering because she intended to reveal that Daniel Wren had survived. Eleanor nodded once. She told me. Inspector Graves stared. She warned you? Yes. The widow laughed softly. A tragic sound. She believed honesty was always the answer. Didn't you? No, the answer came instantly. For the first time, genuine emotion appeared in her face. Honesty destroys people. Nobody spoke. Eleanor looked older than ever. Margaret never understood that. Miss Marple watched her carefully. What happened that evening? The widow stared toward the rain-swept windows. She asked me to meet her. At Hawthorne House? Yes. What did she say? She said she intended to tell everyone. A pause. She said the village deserved the truth. The widow swallowed. And then? She turned away. Another pause. A longer one. Then Eleanor whispered, and I struck her. The confession fell into the room like a stone into still water. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. I picked up the bronze horse from the desk. Tears appeared in her eyes. I only meant to stop her. Her voice broke. Only stop her. Inspector Graves remained silent. He had heard such words before. Many times. Too many. Miss Marple lowered her gaze. The old story. The familiar tragedy. One impulsive moment. One terrible decision. One life ended forever. Eleanor wiped her eyes. When she fell, I knew. No one answered. I knew there was no undoing it. Outside, rain struck the windows. Inside, only the ticking clock remained. At last, Inspector Graves stepped forward. Eleanor Finch. The widow nodded. I know. "You are under arrest for the murder of Margaret Harcourt." Again she nodded. No resistance. No protest. Only exhaustion. As Sergeant Bell approached, Eleanor looked toward Miss Marple. "You solved it because of the handwriting." "Partly. And the ledger." "Yes." The widow managed a faint smile. "Margaret would have approved. I believe she would." For the first time, Eleanor looked relieved. Then she allowed herself to be led away. Later that evening, peace returned to Hawthorne House. The storm had passed. Moonlight shimmered across the sea. Inspector Graves stood beside Miss Marple near the window. 3 women. Yes, 1 lie. Yes, 1 lie. Yes, 1 lie. Miss Marple smiled. "The title sounds almost theatrical when you put it that way." He laughed, then became thoughtful. "The strangest thing is that Clara, Edith, and Beatrice spent 20 years fearing exposure. Human beings often do. And the secret wasn't what killed Margaret. No." Miss Marple looked toward the distant lighthouse. "The murder came from something simpler. Fear? Yes," she nodded. "Fear and love mixed together, a dangerous combination." Inspector Graves considered that. It seemed true. Many terrible things began with hatred, but just as many began with desperate affection. For a few moments they watched the moonlit harbour. Then Graves spoke. "And what happens now?" Miss Marple smiled. "The village will gossip, undoubtedly. The church committee will argue. Certainly. The harbour fishermen will exaggerate every detail. Without question." The inspector laughed. "And you?" Miss Marple picked up her knitting. "I shall return home and enjoy a perfectly peaceful cup of tea." The lighthouse beam swept across the dark sea. The mystery was finished. The dead had received justice. The living had received truth. And somewhere beyond the cliffs, the quiet village of Larkspur Cove settled once more into ordinary life, which, Miss Marple often reflected, was where mysteries always began. The end.